And you also make an interesting point in that the U.S. dollar in all fiat currencies, ever since going off the gold standard in 1971, of course, the U.S. adopted what is effectively the petrodollar, so that what you're saying is the oil collapse is taking away the only real collateral to the U.S. dollar. And so it's a twin collapse of both energy collapse, but also fiat currency U.S. dollar collapse. Is that correct?
All fiat currencies are doomed. There's no question about it in my mind. With the European collapse, which is well underway, and I think the euro zone is doomed, and I think the euro is doomed. That's pretty clear. We're seeing a little boost to the dollar as people flee, but it's like changing decks on the Titanic as it's sinking. All fiat currencies are doomed because really what's happening is a $700 trillion derivatives bubble is imploding. And there is no way to service that debt. The only way for people to really survive is to disengage as much as possible from the monetary paradigm.
Okay, and just to put a little additional point on what I'm trying to say there. In other words, the fiat currency, the fractional reserve, the global pyramid scheme that is monetarization of the money supply is backed up by essentially oil. So even if you could make the case that these fiat currencies might have some intrinsic value at some point tied to oil, the fact is that oil is now peaked. So really that's the final nail in the coffin. What about technology? People say, you know what, we're going to come up with new technology. Yes. We're going to replace the oil standard paradigm. What about this, Mike Ruppert?
In my book, Confronting Collapse, and to a smaller extent in the movie, I laid out very clearly there is no combination of any alternative energy sources that will replace the edifice built by fossil fuels. You've got 800 million internal combustion powered vehicles on the planet with 7 gallons of oil in every tire, and it taking maybe 15, 20,000 gallons of oil each to make in terms of the energy input. And we don't have any other technology to plug in, and those vehicles will only run on, and that includes airplanes and ships, on oil. And we waited way too long, and there's a number of studies that have confirmed that, some from the U.S. government. There is nothing to change to. We waited way too long.
Okay, the EIA, the statistics arm of the Department of Energy, recently released its International Energy Outlook for 2010. They still see production rising from 86 million barrels per day to 92 million barrels per day by 2020. Your thoughts?
Well, and the Minerals Management Service of the U.S. government also told us that all the rigs operating in the Gulf were safe. I mean, people really need to get over this idea that government tells the truth. Both the EIA, which is a part of the U.S. government, and the IEA, which is a UN organization, are offering conflicting reports. But the International Energy Agency has basically come out within the last 6 months, basically since the movie's been out, and said, no, we're running out. We're changing all of our numbers. All these rosy predictions we put out for all that time were not correct.
All right, now, I think the biggest takeaway here is that this Gulf oil disaster is clear evidence of peak oil. It's a bit counterintuitive because a lot of pundits will say, look, there's so much oil out there, it's spilling everywhere. How can that be peak oil? But given in the context of the global actual demand for oil, this is not should not be construed in any way as being evidence of there being lots of oil. This Gulf oil disaster is tied to peak oil in that people are going after riskier finds, which are more costly, and of course the cost for this disaster and the cleanup, it has to be, even though BP is not going to pay for it apparently, somebody's going to pay for it, and that's the cost of peak oil. Is that a fair characterization?
Basically, yes. That's very good. I mean, if there was an abundance of oil, we would still be pumping oil out of the ground in Texas with a net energy cost far less. How much energy do you put in versus the energy you get out? Saudi Arabia is now drilling offshore. Some of the biggest fields in the world are in decline. Production is proof. Cantarell in Mexico, the North Sea is in decline, Bergen in Kuwait. All these supergiant fields are falling off a cliff in terms of production. Okay,
I noticed you didn't mention Ghawar in Saudi Arabia because I guess they don't publish figures.
Well, I think it's very clear that Saudi Arabia has passed its peak of production, and that's the last thing the Saudi government can afford to let a restive population know. I am in complete agreement with Matthew Simmons, the world's largest energy investment banker, whose book Twilight in the Desert clearly documented Saudi decline, and the fact is they lie. Why should we be surprised if oil companies and nation states lie when we've seen Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, we've seen Citigroup, AIG, we've seen all of this huge lying and the current lying by BP about what they're doing. These people don't tell the truth. You have to measure it by what the observable facts are and stop listening to what the lips are saying. Right.
So Counter-Rail in Mexico, Bergen in Kuwait, they're down, I believe, something, these giant super fields, 20% year over year. Is that correct?
I don't recall the exact statistics, but let's take Cantarell in Mexico, which was the biggest field that Pemex, the Mexican State Petroleum Company, had. Its production is down something like 30% over the last 5 years, but that trend is continuing to go down. And that's an underlying cause for the massive social unrest in Mexico, because most of Mexico's GDP was a result of Mexican oil exports, which are falling off a cliff. Hence, you have massive unemployment, you have increasing poverty, a Mexican government that's basically crippled right now with no income. This is where the cartels are stepping in to fill the void. But this dislocation is a clear example of what collapse looks like in Mexico. It's happening now all over the world, either economically or as a result of energy. So, this is what it looks like.
Yeah, it's funny because the politicians in Arizona want to build bigger and bigger walls to keep out immigrants. But from what you're saying, what others are saying, it's all tied back to peak oil, which is really the 800-pound gorilla that nobody wants to talk about. Okay, Mike Ruppert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
All righty, now Michael's film, Collapse, is out today, June 15th, in DVD form. So, get it, because it's fantastic. It ties a lot of the loose ends together and will help you understand why the crisis in the banking sector is tied to the oil sector. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. I want to thank my guests, Stacey Herbert and Mike Ruppert. And if you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.